Hi, everyone. Just bear with us a moment as we're admitting people from the waiting room, and we'll get started in just a moment. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started, even though a few people are trickling in from the waiting room. So thank you so much for joining us. I am thrilled to be your moderator for a timely webinar brought to you by the American Bar Association section of Civil Rights and Social Justice entitled Deepfakes, Deception, and Disinformation, Regulating Fakery in Campaign Speech. The section on civil rights and social justice is actively planning additional programs on a variety of issues, and you can visit americanbar.org/CRSJ for updates on all of these upcoming programs. During today's program, we encourage you, please ask questions of panelists using the Q&A function, not the chat function. If you're not seeing those controls, just make sure that your screen is not idle, and we'll be monitoring the Q&A. We'll do the best to address your questions, time permitting, and might address them directly in the Q&A if we can't address them verbally. And we will share a recording of this program for everyone who is registered, and it will be on the section's YouTube channel. So please share that recording widely with your networks. My name is Frank LoMonte. I am the co-chair of the Free Speech and Free Press Committee under this section. My day job is as legal counsel with CNN in Atlanta. I'm an adjunct instructor at the University of Georgia School of Law. I will start with my disclaimer that I do not speak for any of those acronyms today. I am here on my own nickel, but very, very happy to be presenting this timely, could not be more timely panel with the election less than a month away, of experts to talk to us about the problem of online disinformation and what regulators are trying to do about it. So joining us today are Ilana Beller, who is the organizing manager of the democracy team with the nonprofit Public Citizen. Ilana has worked as an organizer with the Democratic Party of Virginia in several campaigns, including Elizabeth Warren for president. She's a graduate of Cornell, holds a graduate degree from NYU. Amy Cyphert is with us. She's associate professor at the West Virginia University College of Law. Before joining the faculty at West Virginia, she clerked in the Southern District of New York and practiced law with Wilmer Hale. She's a graduate of Carnegie Mellon with her law degree from Harvard. And Donie O'Sullivan is with us. He's senior correspondent with Cable News Network, CNN. Donie's been with CNN for 9 years, and his assignments have included covering the January 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol. Donie holds a master's degree in political science from Queen's University Belfast in Northern Ireland. And thankfully, there's no news going on in the world today, so he's got nothing to do with this hour but chat with us. So thanks for making time to join us at this busy time. I wanted to get started with Donie by just giving us sort of the lay of the land here. Donie, you are, in addition to covering political news, you spend a lot of time online looking at kind of online culture and counterculture and the activities of bad actors in the political space. So maybe talk a little bit about both what you're seeing online and what you're seeing on the ground as you interact with people in campaign events about disinformation and the effects of disinformation on people's voting behavior.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Thanks for asking me along, Frank. Glad to know I haven't annoyed you enough at CNN yet that you are sick of me. Yeah, I've been covering misinformation at CNN and at my previous job at Storyful for more than a decade now, in various different forms. And I guess, we really started talking about deepfakes and AI manipulated media for the first time, really. I think it was around 2017 or 2018. And I remember we actually, in the run-up, I think, to the 2020 election, there was a lot of talk that deepfakes, artificial intelligence, could be used in a way to really kind of supercharge disinformation. Of course, you'll probably remember that in 2016 and after that, there was a lot of talk about how social media had been used, whether it was by domestic or foreign actors, notably Russian trolls, for instance. So there was a lot of fear going into 2020 that AI would be used in a big way like that. We didn't really see it happen then as much, but I think really what we have seen over now, well, I guess it's been 2 years now since the release of ChatGPT, that I think really kind of really hit home that how powerful this technology is. We've now just seen it, you see every day these kind of fake images and videos that are floating around the place. But first I wanted to show you a quick clip, a demonstration we did almost 2 years ago, actually, February 2023, where we played around with some AI generative technology. This was a technology that allowed you to create fake voices. So this is about a 3-minute clip, if you'll indulge me.
Tonight, Donie is back with a look at how AI can fake our own voices, including my own.
Hello?
Hi, Mom.
Hi, Donie. How are you?
Does my voice sound different to you?
Yeah, I just said that to Sinead. I said, Donie sounds so American.
This is not actually me. This is a voice made by computer.
Oh my God, are you serious?
Yeah, I'm sorry. There has been an explosion in fake audio and voices being generated through artificial intelligence technology.
This is an AI cloned version of Walter White's voice.
This is an AI cloned version of Leonardo DiCaprio's voice.
All you need is a couple of minutes recording of anyone's voice and you can make it seem like they have said just about anything, even
Anderson Cooper. We've come here to UC Berkeley today to talk to Hani Farid, a digital forensic expert, about just how easy it is to put words into other people's mouths.
it's a lot of fun,
Sure.
but it's also really scary.
I think once you put aside that gee whiz factor, I don't think it takes a long time to look at the risks.
This is Wolf Blitzer. Hani Farid, you are in the Situation Room.
That sounds
That's good.
That sounds
That's
pretty
good.
good. By uploading just a few minutes of me and some of my colleagues' voices to an AI audio service, I was able to create some convincing fakes, including this one of Anderson Cooper.
Donie O'Sullivan is a real piece of shit.
That's AI.
Is it really?
That's AI.
That's good.
Yeah, Anderson is really good.
Man.
Because Anderson doesn't have a stupid Irish accent.
The technology did struggle with my Irish accent, but we decided to put it to the ultimate test with my parents.
I am about to try call my mom back in Ireland and see if I can trick her with this voice.
Yeah.
Think I'm going to be successful?
I'm nervous. I'm like, my hands are.
All right.
Hello?
Hi, Mom.
Hi, Donie. How are you?
Just finished shooting our story here. I'm going to the airport in a while.
All right. There seems to be a delay in the phone, Donie.
Can I say a quick hello to Dad?
Yeah.
Hi, Donie.
Hi, Dad.
How are you here?
How are you?
Good yourself?
Just finished shooting our story here. I'm going to the airport in a
How
while.
are you? Oh, you come back again now?
Are Kerry playing this weekend?
They're playing Caroline Sunday.
My dad went on to have a conversation with the AI Donie about how Kerry, our home football team, had a game that weekend. Eventually, I had to come clean.
Dad, I'll give you a call better later on. Could you just put me back on to Mom for a second?
My parents knew something was off, but ultimately they still fell for it.
Oh, yeah. Some of it don't do that, but it was like your voice was a little tone lower and it sounded very serious.
Yeah.
Like you had something serious to say. Because I went, oh, geez, my heart was hopping first.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, the voice is very funny. The voice is very funny, yeah.
All right.
All right, Donie.
I'll call you later, Dad.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Is this not classic? The mom is like, something's wrong with my son. The dad's like, everything's fine.
So, yeah, as you can see there, my parents later disowned me. But look, obviously we had a bit of fun with that, but we wanted to make a point of, which is just how powerful this technology is. We didn't name it in that story for legal reasons at the time, but the technology we used, it was called 11 Labs, which is openly available now to anybody. You can literally just drop in a few, seconds of somebody's voice and make it sound like they've said anything. And I believe it was actually 11 Labs that was used. You might remember earlier this year in New Hampshire, there was a fake voice robocall that went around of Joe Biden telling Democrats not to vote. It was made using this technology. So look, there's a lot of stuff out there. It's really, really powerful. And I know we're going to get into a conversation about what can be done about it. I would just say in a kind of very shortened version in terms of what I've seen from the platforms and various efforts by lawmakers and things around the world is that doesn't really seem to me that anybody truly has this under control at the moment. I don't think that's a controversial thing to say. But final point I will make for now is that back to the point of how is this changing, misinformation, disinformation, our perception of reality. Obviously, you could hear there, you can make it sound like somebody says something they didn't, which is really concerning. And this technology is being used in frauds. If you can call a mom or grandma or granddad and make it sound like their kid or grandkid is in distress and have to transfer money, that is happening right now. But I think almost more dystopian and more concerning is because this technology is out there now and most of the world knows about it, that it's possible to make fakes so realistic. It also gives people the ability to deny reality, right? And you've seen that a bit. You've actually seen it with former President Trump, where the reflex is already there to say if something happens that he doesn't like, that he can claim that it's false. He actually did it recently. He was seen leaving a court, I think in New York, where his hand was up in the air and dozens of press photographers captured images of him with kind of these red blotches on his hand. So it wasn't fake, it was out in the real world. Professional photographers captured it, but when he was asked about it later, he immediately said, oh, well, that's AI. So I think that is really where we can be in a space where things get very, very murky. Frank.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm actually going to share real quick an example of this in the political context. I mean, as you pointed out, you can have some fun with this, you can fool your friends, you can also commit some really heinous acts of fraud. But the thing that is animating legislators to act these days are the potential of AI to be used to distort the political discourse. And an example of this appeared on the former Twitter X platform recently. I'm just going to play a couple seconds of it.
Today. And yesterday was today, yesterday. Tomorrow will be today, tomorrow. So live today. So the future today will be as the past today, as it is tomorrow. Today is today. And yesterday was today, yesterday. Tomorrow will be today.
Right. So you see that it's entirely possible to create and just for clarity, not real, just for clarity, that's a distorted Harris voice that was superimposed over video to make it look like she was incoherent and slurring. And it was very easy to use technology to distort someone's voice in a very realistic and convincing way like that. So that's out there in the online discourse. And I want to turn to Ilana Bello now. Lying in campaigns is definitely not anything new. It literally goes back as old as the Republic. There are people who circulated fraudulent forged letters that were purported to be written by George Washington claiming that the Revolutionary War was a mistake. So literally lying in political campaigns is a time-honored tradition in our Republic. But there is something about this new technology that is lighting a fire under our legislators and causing them to consider regulating speech in a way that they would previously may not have been inclined to do with political speech. So talk a little bit about what you, first of all, I guess I think of public citizen as, oh, these are the people that made sure I have seatbelts and airbags in my car. So how did you get from seatbelts and airbags to being interested in online political discourse? And then what are you seeing out there as state legislators respond to this torrent of online fakery?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Frank. So, yep, my name's Ilana. I lead public citizen state legislative work around artificial intelligence. Um, so how did we get here? I mean, public citizen does do a lot of work around democracy issues. And so when we saw this particular issue, coming up, it was just such a glaring concern. And we felt like we couldn't just sit there and watch while, folks were potentially using deep fakes to undermine our democracy. I'm going to talk a little bit about, what we're seeing in terms of regulation, but I did just want to note one thing, and I'll talk a little bit more about this a little bit deeper in, but we actually do regulate fraudulent misrepresentation in elections. So the FEC has a rule on the books that is, regulating fraudulent misrepresentation, and it would be regulating those types of letters where folks are pretending this is different from a lie, right? It's not just saying, oh, this person did this thing. This rule would be regulating, like, if I was a legislator and wrote a letter as, my political opponent, that would be would fall under this rule. So I did just want to make that one kind of nuance. So what we are seeing, I think it is helpful to maybe put this in a little bit of the larger context of how we're seeing deepfakes being used in elections a little bit more. So, of course, there's that Kamala one that Frank just showed, but also, I think some of the most disturbing examples of how deepfakes are being used to undermine elections have actually been in other countries. I actually think Donie and I may have talked about this a couple of months ago. We did an interview on this, but one of the kind of most concerning examples took place in Slovakia, where a deepfake was circulated very close to election day, within 48 hours of election day, of one of the two major party leaders, and it depicted them saying that they were trying to rig the election. And this was circulated pretty widely on social media. So that's like a nightmare scenario of what this could look like. But what I always say is it really only takes one really bad deepfake to undermine a major election. Right. And so, we've also, I think we talk a lot about the New Hampshire example, or some of the kind of examples that have come out of the Trump campaign, or when DeSantis was still running, DeSantis, or, the major campaigns that we're looking at. But we are seeing other examples of this in the United States. So in North Carolina's 6th congressional district, a PAC actually circulated a deep fake of one of the two candidates, basically saying that he was unfit for office. So we're definitely seeing examples similar to this in the United States as well. So I guess I'll launch into what folks are actually doing about this. I'm going to start at the federal level, and then I'm going to do a deep dive into what is being done at the state level. So I do want folks to know, folks are trying to do things at the federal level. It's not like there's nothing being done at all. There was federal legislation that was introduced. It was bipartisan legislation. It's led by Senator Klobuchar, but it was with Senators Hawley, Coons, and Collins. So very bipartisan legislation. That seeks to regulate deepfakes in election communications. That did make it out of the Rules Committee in the Senate, but it's not really clear right now whether that's what's happening there in terms of whether that's moving forward anytime soon. So there is stuff going on a federal level in Congress, but it's not clear if it's moving anytime soon. The FEC, as I mentioned before, has this fraudulent misrepresentation rule. My organization, Public Citizen, actually petitioned them to expand that rule to categorically include fraudulent deepfakes, and they essentially obfuscated. They didn't really do that didn't go anywhere. And then, the other thing that's happening is that the FCC is actually in the process of creating a rule that would put requirements on TV and radio broadcasts when there's a political ad to label AI content. They're trying to figure out how the parameters of that currently, and just finished a public comment period. But the FCC is definitely working diligently to try and do some work in this area. But as I mentioned, that only applies to TV and radio broadcast. And as you probably understood from the examples I just shared, a lot of these are being circulated on social media. So the vast majority of what is going on at a state level. I am going to briefly share my screen. So Public Citizen is tracking all of the legislation that has been put forth on a state level. This is kind of a map of where things have been passed or are still in play, but we're actually tracking every bill that has been introduced on this topic. So you can kind of get a sense of how much there is here. Just to break down some of the numbers for you, 44 states and DC have introduced legislation to try and regulate deepfakes in elections. 19 of those states have actually enacted laws, and one state we expect the governor to sign in the next week. So bring it up to 20, assuming he signs. And most of those laws were put forth in the past year and passed in the past year. And actually virtually every state that could put forth legislation this past year that hadn't already passed something did so. The reason I say virtually every state that could is because some states don't have legislative session on even years, and others don't do election work on major election years. So there's a handful of states that just never would have put this forth, but everyone else, all the other states did. So as you can kind of tell, there's really kind of a broad interest in moving this type of legislation forward. Most of these bills were passed, well, I shouldn't say most, many of these bills were passed with unanimous support by the legislatures. And most, if not all of them, had bipartisan support. And many of them had bipartisan co-sponsorship. So there was just really broad support from the state legislatures around this legislation. Just to kind of very briefly give you an idea of what these bills actually do. So they, for the most part, with the exception of a few new California bills, which we're actually going to discuss in a little bit, they all kind of do something relatively similar, which is that they generally require disclosure when an election communication includes a fraudulent deepfake. They generally, not always, but they usually cover all people who knowingly circulate a deepfake. So in some cases, it's just, PACs or candidates, but in most cases, they cover all people. They have clear specifications for what would constitute adequate disclosure. They often have a number of additional measures to be abundantly cautious around the First Amendment. So usually they only go into effect within a certain window of days leading up to Election Day. They usually have exemptions for satire and parody, not always, but usually. And they also usually have other exemptions as well for bona fide newscasts, for broadcast stations that make a good faith effort to identify a deepfake, et cetera. And then they often, most of the time, they also include the opportunity for the candidate who is depicted to seek injunctive relief, which is really important because in a case like Slovakia, where a deepfake is circulated very close to Election Day, you want to be able to take that down very quickly to dispel the misinformation. So it's kind of this, there's the deterrence, which comes from the penalties, right? And then there's also the kind of ability to kind of quickly address the situation that comes from the injunctive relief. And then finally, in terms of defining deepfake, this varies more so from state to state, but Public Citizen actually has a model bill that I need to put this in the tracker as well in the chat when I'm done speaking. But generally, the definition would include content that is manipulated in a way to create realistic but false images, audio, videos. Generally, they require an intent to injure the reputation of the candidate or otherwise deceive a voter. that the content would appear to a reasonable person to depict a real individual doing or saying something they didn't actually do in real life, and or provide a reasonable person a fundamentally different understanding of the action or speech of the person who's being depicted. So that's kind of what those laws do and where they're at across the country. Like I said, there's been a lot of interest in this legislation and not a lot of pushback for the most part. What we have seen is a lot of times we'll see like Meta, Google, Comcast pushing to weaken the bills and, make them as unrestrictive as possible. But that's, a lot of what we're seeing in the States for the most part. So I guess I'll stop there. I feel like this leads nicely into our next speaker. So Frank, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, super helpful. Thank you. Yeah, you mentioned the California legislation. As Donie said, ChatGPT has only been widely available to the consuming public for about 2 years. So certainly not enough time for cases about ChatGPT to work their way through the federal appellate system. So we don't have a whole lot of guidance from the federal appellate courts about the legal status of AI. But of course, we have decades of guidance from the federal courts about campaign speech and political speech and what can and cannot be regulated. And I'm hoping Professor Cyphert can kind of lay that groundwork for us about the playing field on which these legislators are playing when they venture into the realm of trying to regulate what candidates say or what their supporters say online. And maybe talk a little bit about the first generation of legal challenges that we are seeing, in particular, one that has just recently played out in federal district court in California.
Happy to, Frank. Happy to be speaking with all of you today. I teach classes on artificial intelligence and law, and I actually frequently used to use as a class assignment, try to draft a state deepfake regulation that does not run afoul of the First Amendment. It was a really great drafting exercise for students because it requires them to show not only that they understand deepfakes, and they understand the technical points, but then to think through how this is going to interact with First Amendment law. So it was a great way to test how well they had retained constitutional law and other courses. It was a hard assignment. And I think it's a hard assignment sometimes for state legislatures as well. It's wonderful that Public Citizen is able to provide this model information. I know that there was an ABA section that was also at one point providing some model state legislation. So people are trying, but it's difficult. What are some of the common criticisms we've seen either from litigants or from scholars who are trying to say what will happen as these deepfake laws, and specifically the election deepfake laws, which I think it's really important to note that political speech context, and I'll come back to that in a minute. What are some of the legal challenges that we've either seen or we can expect to see? And obviously the First Amendment is a really big one. So these can be challenged as facial challenges or as applied. They can be challenged as compelled speech, especially because some of the laws require labeling of parody or satire or something like that. And so there's a sense that this is a compelled speech. They can be challenged as prior restraints. And of course, they can also be challenged under all of the various state constitutions. So that would be a lot of the federal First Amendment, but various other state constitutions have different parts to their First Amendment as well. We've also seen challenges under the 14th Amendment as almost like an unconstitutional vagueness challenge, this idea that these things are so impermissibly broad, so unconstitutionally vague that, they really are violative of the 14th Amendment in that sense. And when I originally agreed to speak today, I thought, I can just kind of march everybody through the academic exercise of what we could expect to see. But a week ago today, we actually got an opinion out of the Eastern District of California in a case, Coles v. Bonta. And Coles is a YouTuber known as Mr. Reagan. And this opinion is really literally hot off the press. It was ordered by District Court Judge Mendez a week ago today on October 2nd. And in this opinion, Judge Mendez grants the plaintiff, the YouTuber's request for a preliminary injunction, blocking the implementation of one of the California laws that addressed election deepfakes. and concluded that that law on a facial challenge was likely to succeed on the merits, and was likely violative of the First Amendment, and therefore that it was appropriate to grant a preliminary injunction in that case. And Ilana can discuss more how the California law was different, maybe didn't hit all of the best practices that some of the model legislation would have wanted it to hit. Though I will note, it did try to do a lot of the things that we just discussed as potential best practices, right? So it was time bound and only kicked in within a certain number of days before and after an election. There was a malice requirement that you had to, with malice, do these things. There was a knowledge requirement. There was a mens rea. It tried to provide safe harbors for parody and for satire. And yet the district court judge determined that it was likely to violate the First Amendment. And so a preliminary injunction was granted. And one thing that I think is really striking as I read through Judge Mendez's opinion is the really sweeping language that was used to talk about just how cherished political speech is in our democratic history, and that even speech that is caustic, even speech that is false, can still be protected by the First Amendment, and indeed, in the context of political speech, perhaps must be protected by the First Amendment. Judge Mendez cited to cases like the Alvarez stolen valor case and the Net Choice case that came down last summer to say we are really seriously, aggressively protecting the First Amendment, and that changes in technology are not going to water down the protections of First Amendment rights that people have to speak. And so I think there's a lot of caveats that have to be put out, right? First caveat, again, the California law had a few problematic elements that Judge Mendez's opinion addresses. Number two, this is one district court judge, and maybe it will turn out that Judge Mendez is an outlier. Of course, because this is a granted preliminary injunction, it is immediately appealable. And so I think we'll see what the Ninth Circuit decides it's going to do with this case, and how quickly they make that decision. But I really do think that this opinion, if you haven't read it yet, it's a really kind of nice, easy to digest 21-page opinion. I think it's worth reading because it really does lay out the stakes as being, yes, California's interest in protecting election fairness and integrity is incredibly important, and yet there is this incredibly powerful First Amendment right that we have to balance with it. So I know in the Q&A earlier, I saw that people were saying, well, in light of the fact that some of these things are being struck down, what would be the right language? What are the magic words? What is going to be narrow enough? And we don't know yet. Again, I think Judge Mendez's opinion could turn out to be an outlier. Other judges may see it differently. Perhaps even other judges on the Ninth Circuit might see it differently. But for now, at least, what California tried to do in the wisdom of one federal judge was impermissible. So we can talk a lot more, and I'm sure we will, about the legal challenges to these. And I do note that Judge Mendez said, listen, I understand how potentially damaging and dangerous these can be. Judge Mendez was not dismissive of the concerns that led the legislators to enact this law. And yet, it seemed to be the idea is if you want to get rid of this false and dangerous speech, you have to flood it out with more true speech. You can't ban it. So back to you, Frank.
Yeah, well, I warned the panel coming in that when you have a hot issue, you get a hot bench, and we have a hot bench of questioners today. So while I walked in the door with some of my own, I want to make sure that everybody participating gets theirs answered first. So I'm going to take some of these out of order. Amy, maybe you could, because my favorite way of practicing constitutional law is on the fly as I go along. Maybe you can practice some on the fly constitutional law for us and take a look at the Texas statute that was shared in the Q&A and just give us a quick take on that. But I will give you a few minutes to do that while I ask Donie one of the other questions, which is, a really good comment that, look, because of the pervasive discussion around online fakery, these kinds of posts like the one I shared about Vice President Harris get almost immediately shot down and debunked. So are these things really having any impact on the quality of discourse and on people's voting behavior? Or are they just a bunch of noise that people kind of quickly dismiss and recognize as being nothing but foolery?
Ooh, that's the $1 million question, Frank. I think it's a few different things. I mean, I certainly think we need to be very careful in this space, which is why even the platforms, as they try and regulate speech on their platforms, social media platforms, it's obviously an extremely tricky thing. I don't need to tell anybody on this call about that. So, and I think you see sometimes, especially from Democrats, from the left, because this is extremely politicized issue and it's obviously an election year. But there's a lot of things that are clearly are meant to be satirical or clearly meant to be fake or obviously fake. And sometimes you will have people on one side of the political spectrum getting really tied up in knots trying to say that this should be taken down, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this kind of push to extreme censorship that I think we have to be very mindful of. But what I would say is that, look, I think a lot of this stuff, people know it's fake. A lot of this stuff, they view it, it's a meme, it's fun, it's funny. But then sometimes it's well, one, if it plays into your existing biases, you're more likely to believe it. But two, sometimes people don't know it's fake, even if it's very clearly, obviously fake to you or me. And sometimes we can fall for this stuff ourselves. And I'll just give one example of a few years ago, there was a video. This was during the 2020 election cycle. The Trump campaign put out a video that appeared to show Biden falling asleep during a live TV interview. It was totally fake. There's clips taken from all over the place, but it looks convincing. When I asked the campaign about it at the time, they were like, "You guys at CNN, you need to lighten up. This is clearly a joke, et cetera, et cetera." But when I went to a Trump rally the following week, it was one of the first things a guy said to me. I was like, "Why don't you like Biden?" He said, "He's fallen asleep during live TV interviews." Now, it played into an existing belief that this person had about Biden, and I walked him through the fact check and I showed him things like that. And he said, I could believe it happened anyway. Which I think is really the kind of important thing here, is that this type of material can just help further confirm our existing biases. And I'll also say, you don't necessarily need deepfakes or AI technology for this. Look, after the assassination attempt on Trump in July, there was immediately a lot of people on the other side, Democrats, who were saying that it was staged some way. People on the left were putting that out there online, and even one of my own friends, who would consider themselves an intellectual, New York, mentioned that Trump went golfing the day after his shooting, and there was a picture circulating that showed him with no bandage on his ear, and so with the suggestion that the bandage on the ear at the RNC was all faked or whatever, showmanship. But I was like, really? But that picture, it was true that Trump went golfing, yes, but the picture was actually from several years ago. So, we don't necessarily need the AI to really mislead us here. But all that to say is that, even stuff that seems absurd to some of us might be very, very believable to somebody else.
Yeah, so and that actually plays into a question that I wanted to throw out for anybody who'd like to take a crack at it. But you mentioned, right, that we don't need AI to create online disinformation. as we're sitting here today with a hurricane bearing down on Florida, there are people online speculating that the government has the ability to control the weather with secret magic machines, and no AI is being used for that. We've had Adobe Photoshop for a very long time where people can create very realistic simulations or alterations of photos. So I guess my question is there something, right? We know that there are always outermost boundaries to constitutional rights. And even though there's a Second Amendment right to bear arms, I can't keep an atomic bomb in my nightstand just because it makes me feel safer against burglars, right? So at some extreme point, the technology, like with armaments, becomes so powerful that we're willing to countenance a certain degree of intrusion on otherwise protected rights. And I guess my question is AI that bomb in the nightstand? Is AI that thing that would justify departing from otherwise very well settled legal principles that say that you can't penalize false political speech? Don't everybody jump at once, but Ilana?
I can speak to part of this question. So I think, first of all, one element of your question pertains to how AI is different from other forms of technology that we've used in the past to distort information or kind of further misinformation or create misinformation. And I think, first of all, there's just like a scale difference here, right? Like, it's interesting because Donie's been talking about all these deepfakes that have been circulated over the past couple of years. And this is something I've been thinking a lot about over the past couple of years. And the quality between a year ago and today is unbelievably different. It is the deepfakes that were circulated a year ago, I think some people here would find laughable. The New York Times actually just did this like quiz where they had you guess what's a deepfake video and what is a real video. And I think about deepfakes every single day. I got more of those answers wrong than right. So I think, first of all, the quality of what you can create with this technology is much better and only rapidly improving. Like, I'd love to see Donie try that exercise with his parents again in a year and see what the difference is. I would imagine there's not going to be that same accent issue. The quantity is also a thing here too. We're specifically talking about elections deepfakes, but there's lots of other types of problematic deepfakes, including intimate deepfakes. And one of the things that's a big part of that conversation is the fact that you have people creating these harmful deepfakes at a rate of like 30 per hour, right? It's this ability to create more and create better. And it's in conjunction with this kind of, hand in hand with social media, where this misinformation can just be amplified so much. Yes, this is a much bigger problem than like someone sending around a photoshopped picture 10 years ago. It's like all of these things together creates a perfect storm. And I think one other thing that's just worth noting in response to your question, and then I'll let other people speak to it as well, which is I want to differentiate between lies in political speech, which, yes, we know that there's a constitutional right to lie in political speech. And someone actually asked this in the Q&A, so I might be jumping ahead a little bit, so apologies if so, but there is a fundamental difference between lying and a deep fake. And I want to just highlight that, because I think, and we've seen this when I'm working with legislators on this type of legislation, this comes up again and again in committee hearings, which is that legislators, I think, understand this very personally because it could happen to them. But it's the difference between me saying, or Frank saying, Ilana is a cheater and cheated on this test, versus putting out there and circulating really broadly a very realistic video that everyone would believe is true of me cheating on a test, right? And so I think it's asking people to disbelieve their own eyes and ears, versus like everyone knows people can lie, but there is a difference between hearing a lie from someone and someone, circulating content that proves, theoretically, we historically use our eyes and ears as and that this kind of content as proof. That is fraudulent misrepresentation, which again, we have historically determined fraudulent misrepresentation is not okay. And so, yeah, sorry, just wanted to I may have veered a little bit, but let's
Not at all. No, that's great. Great. And Amy, I wonder if you could take a crack at that, but also kind of informed by what little authority we have from the Supreme Court on online speech so far. I mean, there's been cases like the Packingham case where the Supreme Court struck down a prohibition on people who are convicted of sex offenses using social media. So that so far, speakers are actually undefeated in First Amendment cases in front of the Supreme Court when internet speech is involved. I think they're 5-0, so not very much authority at all. But it's been quite difficult to get any regulation on online speech past the Supreme Court. So, I guess in light of what little guidance we have from the court, is it possible to make a qualitative distinction between AI-aided speech and all the other brands of low-tech falsehood that the Supreme Court has always told us is protected speech?
Yeah, so there's a lot that I want to try to unpack. I want to go back to the original question about the Texas statute that was in the Q&A.
Yes.
And I just want to quickly say, I think that statute would have a lot of problems under Judge Mendez's analysis in the Eastern District of California, right? And in fact, even the language that's used, I thought the language was interesting, true source of communication. Judge Mendez's opinion cites to recent Supreme Court opinion, including Net Choice and Alvarez and other things that we've been discussing, to say, hey, this idea that the government is the arbiter of truth, that we're going to have a ministry of truth, that's really draconian, authoritarian, and frightening, right? And it's incompatible with our constitutional tradition. So I think that Texas statute, at least at the way that Judge Mendez, and again, the caveat of my very quick look at it, at least at the way that Judge Mendez analyzed the California statute, that would be problematic. I really share Ilana's concern that scale means something. It has to mean something, but I don't know yet what it means, Frank. And I don't think the Supreme Court would necessarily know yet what it means. We can look at some of the Section 230 cases and think about how, there was a really interesting moment, and I wrote a law review article about this, where we thought, hey, we know that Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act protects these social media companies from having someone else's speech imputed to them. We're going to protect them from that, and that makes sense. But what about when they algorithmically amplify this speech? What about when they don't just take someone else's speech and let it be on their site? What about when they say, hey, Ilana, did you see what Frank said? Donie, did you see what Frank said? You should be friends with Frank, right? Because Frank is saying these outrageous things. Is that different, right? And we don't have a lot of necessarily great case law yet on that. We had two divided circuits, or I should say 2-2-1 circuits between the Second and the Ninth Circuit, who said, no, that's still Section 230 protected. And the Supreme Court granted cert and then kind of didn't want to deal with that case. So I think scale, the ability to change things algorithmically and to use AI to have virality and to have things spread so quickly has to mean something. But so far, the court has been very insistent that nothing about changing technology changes our First Amendment principles, and that the principles endure and that they are applied to technology. And in fact, the judges say things like, just as the printing press changed the availability of political cartoons, but that didn't change things. Just as broadcast TV changed the way people could hear messages, radio, internet, social media, the court's been consistent. Those things may change the way that we analyze certain cases, but they don't change the First Amendment principles, which remain strong. So I don't know what it would take for the court to say, this is different, though. We need a different understanding of the First Amendment under AI. I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Yeah. So I want to kind of synthesize a couple of the questions in the chat. There are so many excellent ones. And maybe start with Ilana, but also Donie, feel free to jump in on this. Very good point being made. Is it even possible to have an effective, let's leave aside constitutionality for a second. Is it even possible to effectively regulate the flow of technology-aided misinformation online, particularly given, and I think Donie's very familiar with this, right, that a lot of this stuff doesn't originate with traceable actors inside of the constitutional United States. So the idea that you're going to be dragged in front of a court in Texas or in Minnesota and made to pay some misdemeanor penalty for your false speech doesn't mean that much to somebody in Belarus, right? And so is it even possible to have an effective regulation here? And if not, are we lulling people into thinking that the problem has been solved, right? Is it possible that people would then go online and say, oh, well, thank goodness, I know now it's illegal to distribute deepfake aided speech and that problem has been solved. So therefore, the things that I encounter online must be trustworthy and believable.
This is a great question. So a couple of things. The way the most of these laws work is the focus is on the distributor rather than the creator, because absolutely there is going to be a problem. There is a problem in identifying who created this content. In a lot of cases, it's just incredibly difficult to determine. And so the onus is on the distributor for most of these laws. In terms of whether this solves the problem, it is a bite of the apple, right? It's a step. It's a step in the right direction. Without these laws, it is legal to circulate a deepfake to try to undermine the outcome of the election. That cannot be the case in this country, right? Like we can't just have this be completely unregulated. Whether these laws themselves solve all the issues, no, of course not. There's always going to be people who try to get around the law or who may decide to break the law, regardless of the fact that they might, that they will, face a penalty. But these regulations are a step to try to deter people from, and I'm sure they will deter people from circulating deepfakes. They probably won't deter all people. It's absolutely true. And there is an issue with foreign actors, 100%. That's, of course, that's an issue. One element of these laws that is really important that I highlighted very briefly when I was first talking, but that injunctive relief piece, the ability to very quickly take down and start dispelling the information is really critical. And that, is in effect regardless of whether the foreign actor is the bad actor who's circulating the deepfake, right? So it's not just the deterrence, it's also the ability to handle the issue that is being supported by these laws. But yeah, I don't think this solves the entirety of the issue. I don't think it lulls people into a false sense of security either. I think we know that this is a danger that's out there, and people more and more will understand that this is a danger out there if they don't already. But I think what it does do is also signal, this is not something that's acceptable, because if these things are totally legal, why wouldn't people be circulating deepfakes left and right to try and undermine elections, right? And so it signals a value, and it also does serve as a deterrent, but it's true that I'm sure it won't deter all people from.
Yeah, Donie, any thoughts on the whack-a-mole problem?
Ooh, I think, well, look, there's been a lot of reporting about Telegram recently, right? The social media platform ran by Pavel Durov, who was arrested in France. Now, potentially as a result of that, they're cracking down a little bit on some of what's on that platform. But like Telegram, for people who don't know, is hugely popular now in the United States. It's not anywhere near the Facebook level or anything like that, but yeah, there's just these wild wests all over the place, or even just your family WhatsApp groups, which is less a thing in the US at the moment among English-speaking communities, but very big in Spanish-speaking communities in the US where things get forwarded and shared all around. There's not really a place, you're not going to be able to regulate what's happening in them. But I think to Lana's point, in terms of having some consequences of the creation of this from a very high level, could obviously help a bit. But yeah, it really is a whack-a-mole, and you'll even see even the platforms themselves, the platforms that allow for the creation of this, whether it's, basically all the companies now have generative AI capabilities. They try and put in rules in places where they say, oh, you can't create an image or make a voice that sounds like Trump or sounds like Harris, but really doesn't take a genius at all to figure out a way to get around that. So yeah, genie's out of the bottle a bit, and it's tough to figure out how to get a handle on it.
I want to again try to synthesize a couple questions and shoot them Amy's way here. So two-parter for you. Part one, if you look at the judge's opinion in the Coles case, he talks about the over-inclusiveness of that statute and the preference that the courts have always held for counter-speech as a remedy. And it leans heavily on that. Look, why isn't counter-speech a fully effective and constitutionally permissible remedy? But good question in the chat, right? Is counter-speech effective in the online discourse? If an opponent of Harris puts up a TikTok showing her slurring her words falsely, and the Harris campaign decides to talk back, are those same people following the Kamala Harris TikTok account, right? Are opponents of Kamala Harris likely to see the counter speech at all, or has the bloodstream been so polluted by the falsehood that counter speech is not effective? So that's part one, I guess, getting back to the question of, is this just a different time and a different technology and a different playing field that calls for different rules? And part two is the line drawing problem, right? The questioner asks, well, can't you lie to people to convince them to vote? Can't you lie to people to get them to change their votes now? And is there something about just being able to lie in an especially persuasive or convincing way using these visuals that would dictate abandoning our traditional disfavor for content-based regulation?
Yeah, well, I love those questions. And I certainly think that if I were, an attorney for the defendants, state governments who are being sued for these laws, I would certainly be making that point, the first point you made, right? Yes, Your Honors, you're right. Normally, the remedy for bad speech is good speech that drowns it out. However, when one side has a megaphone and the other side doesn't, right? Or something along those lines, to try to get the court to say, we're not actually asking you to change the test. We're asking you to apply the test differently here, given the changed circumstances. How well would that land? I don't know. I think you would have to have a whole lot of evidentiary submissions. You would need some mini trial on the idea of, can you reach people when they are sort of down these rabbit hole echo chambers or not, right? So I think it's a very good point, but I think it's a point that goes to the way the test is applied and less sort of about what the test is. And on your second point, I really like Ilana's answer. Like from a personal perspective, I like her answer. This isn't a lie. This is proof of a lie, and that's got to be different. I don't know if that's actually how a court would approach it, right? Like I am persuaded on a personal level that there's a there. I think she's right about something. There's something fundamental she's saying there. However, again, I don't know that based on the cases we've seen, that courts are necessarily there yet, or that they're sort of willing to be there. I think that Judge Mendez and other judges say, listen, you've got defamation law, you've got other tort law, you've got other things you can do if you feel like you have been harmed. If you feel like, oh gosh, well, it looks like I did this thing, and so I've got a problem. You have other remedies. The remedy can't be banning speech. The remedy will have to be seeking redress after the speech has harmed you in some way. And maybe, I think Ilana might even make the point, there is no remedy once you've lost the election because of the thing, right? Like that's irreparable harm too. But so far, that's not how judges have seen it. And maybe, I hate to say this, but sometimes shifts in law are, they happen because of really catastrophic, awful things. So maybe we see some catastrophic, awful thing happen in an election, and then people start looking at it differently. I don't know. I guess stay tuned.
Yeah, there's an interesting remark in the chat, again, talking about does the advent of new and different technology require new and different constitutional standards? Somebody made the observation, well, is this in any way analogous to putting an electronic tracker on somebody's car that normally, right, the police can follow your car, they can look at your car, they can have a dog walk around and sniff your car, and none of those things violate the First Amendment. But once they attach a GPS tracker to your car to follow its movements, now the Fourth Amendment is implicated because of the intrusiveness of that technology. So I wonder if, and the Supreme Court has also taken a baby step into this, if you remember the cell phone search case,
I was
right?
just about to say, this is
right.
the cell phone search case.
Talk about that, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, just the idea that, as I hold up my cell phone here, that if you think of normal jurisprudence over when can you have a search and seizure that involves checking someone's pockets, right? And flash back to the lovely 1980s, right? To my childhood. If you frisked someone's pockets, you were probably going to get their wallet, and that probably has their ID. It may have some money, it may have credit cards, it may have even, a few things about them. Maybe you would get a calendar, maybe not, some photos, all of that, right? You could take those things and that can be thought of as a type of intrusive thing, but there was a limit on what you were going to get. Now imagine that you are frisking someone and you take their cell phone and you are able to access their cell phone. You have their medical records, you have every correspondence that they've written with their employer or with their spouse or with their friends. You have their social media accounts, you have their photos, maybe every photo they've taken in the last 7 years. You have so much more information about them, and that has to change the reasonableness of a search and seizure. And courts have agreed with that, right? They have said, hey, this is different. But again, they didn't change the test. They said it's less reasonable. So again, I think what I keep trying to push back on is the idea, I don't know that we need a new test, but we may need better factual development of what the actual harms are here. So we may need courts to think differently about what's the irreparable harm to the plaintiff claiming I'm harmed by this act versus what's the irreparable harm to the state if the election is compromised because of deepfakes. It may just be that we need to weigh those things differently, but not actually alter the test.
I want to mention that there is, in addition to the brand new ruling out of California, we're going to get one soon out of Minnesota as well. The very same plaintiff, the Twitter handle Mr. Reagan, has a case pending in Minnesota as well. And the wrinkle there that is different, and I thought maybe I'd start with Ilana on this, but Amy, feel free to jump in too, is that statute carries criminal penalties as well. Ilana, you talked about the possibility of getting injunctive relief, and California actually has two parallel laws. They have a law that is directed at the speaker, and they have a law that's directed at the platforms. And the speaker-directed law was the one that was just enjoined. There's a lot of questions about whether the platform-focused one can survive. And Amy, you're welcome to talk about that too, in light of what we the body language that we got from the Supreme Court in Net Choice too. But I guess is criminalization different? Is criminalization, and the Texas statute that was shared earlier also has misdemeanor criminal penalties that was shared in the Q&A. Is criminalization different? And I noticed that Public Citizen in its model doesn't have criminal penalties. Is that just qualitatively a different step? And then Amy, maybe you can address, as a First Amendment matter, is that qualitatively a different step when you actually start jailing people for speech?
Yeah, this is a great question. So I think I can answer part of this. I'm not a lawyer, full disclosure. I work with lawyers who make a lot of this type of decision for us, but we did purposely decide not to include criminal penalties. What the states are doing really does vary from state to state. So there are a number of states that have criminal penalties. It's not the majority of states, but certainly there are a number of states that have passed laws that include criminal penalties. I think, you know, I'll leave it to the lawyers, so okay, Amy on this panel, to speak to whether this, you know, what this means in terms of the law. But I think one thing I did want to mention with both Minnesota and California is certainly part of what is coloring the judge in California's opinion on this seems to be the way some drafting issues, quite frankly, and we see this in Minnesota even more so. Minnesota does not have an exemption for satire, which is absolutely an issue and not what most of the states have done. And then in California, it seems pretty clear that, and this is not all of what is going on in California by any means, but two things that have really colored the judge's decision are, A, there was like this very strange drafting element that required that the disclosure be as large as the largest font in an ad, so as to make the ad essentially unreadable with the disclosure. And then also there is this very strange satire labeling requirement, which just obviously, if you're labeling satire, you're defeating the purpose of satire. And so that is not what most states have done either. And so I think that was just kind of following up on, you know, these two lawsuits. There are some very specific kind of like drafting things that are going on in the lawsuits as well. But in terms of, you know, criminal penalties versus civil penalties and what that means in terms of taking a step further, I would definitely defer to Amy on that.
I mean, I don't think I'm going to blow the socks off any of the lawyers on this call when I say, yes, if you're talking about criminal penalties, you are even on shakier First Amendment ground in so many ways. Now, which is not to say that you can't have criminal penalties for speech, right? Like you actually can have First Amendment exceptions for things like, you know, incitement to lawfulness or something, or lawlessness, or something like that, right? So I'm not trying to suggest that, oh gosh, the First Amendment, you can never be criminally prosecuted for speech. You absolutely can. But I think that anytime you have a case where it's already a close call and one of the penalties is criminal prosecution, again, so much of this is balancing, so much of this is looking at under strict scrutiny or even intermediate scrutiny, looking at all of the different impacts and effects and balancing. Is this really the most narrowly tailored way you could have done this? Is this really the thing that was going to give the government their ends? And so I just think that when courts are already skeptical of civil penalties, I really think that criminal penalties are going to be a bridge too far in any kind of election deepfake case. But, you know, I guess, again, if you're trying to argue, gee, there's this incitement that these deepfakes are doing, but I probably wouldn't want to have to try to make that argument. I think it would be a very much uphill climb.
There's a question in the chat that directs itself to the issue that I flagged, that so much of this malign online activity is not originating inside the United States, and it's people who are going to be outside the jurisdiction of the state courts of California or Minnesota or Texas. And the question is asking, is there anything being done at the international level? For instance, trying to affect the outcome of an election as an act of aggression that directed to our sovereignty. And Donie, I'm just going to put you on the spot here because I happen to have one of your stories in front of me now that you and several of your colleagues here at CNN have written a little bit about what the Justice Department is doing to try to go after some of these internationally based bad actors. And maybe you can talk just for a second about what you're seeing on that front.
Yeah, things are very murky. I guess what we saw back in, you know, almost 10 years ago now in 2015 and 16, and what we learned after a 16 election was how, you know, take a country like Russia was able to really leverage the very powerful targeting tools that Facebook has to basically just kind of stir the pot in the US, kind of set up infiltrated activist groups, set up these kind of very divisive type groups that were sharing content on both sides of the political spectrum. Common tactics that any country has done for decades offline. But I guess what US American adversaries realize now is that they can just pay a lot of US citizens to do a lot of this stuff for them in terms of creating this type of content. And they can, the story you showed there, the DOJ said all the Americans involved basically, or at least the people who were the commentators and stuff who were paid, the American commentators, were victims in that they didn't know that they were basically doing the bidding of a foreign government. So therefore, it's not like they are running afoul of a FARA violation or anything like that. It's, I guess the point I'm getting at though is just it's the internet allows for so many new ways to pay people for this sort of stuff, and in a way that it can be obscured and masked. And two, the sort of engagement, the click chasing that I think the internet had kind of tried to cut out a few years ago, in terms of just like putting the most ridiculous stuff out there for engagement. The social media platforms were pulling back a little bit on that, but under X and Elon Musk, it's very much alive and well. So it just kind of all creates a environment where all of this stuff is not only can thrive, but like this type of disinformation, whether it be AI generated or otherwise, is actually incentivized on a platform like X and many others.
Yeah. Well, I could listen to this group talk forever about this, but I promised that I would bring us in for a landing at 1:15, and I've got 1:14. So I am just going to extend my very warm thanks to our panelists, Ilana Beller, Amy Cyphert, and Donie O'Sullivan, and really appreciate you sharing your expertise, and everybody online who jumped in with the outstanding and excellent questions too. Apologies if we didn't get to every one of them. So thanks to everybody for joining us for this webinar, and we want to extend our gratitude to not just the panelists, but to the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice for hosting this conversation. The section provides a variety of free webinars and resources for legal professionals and advocates nationally, and we hope you find this useful in your work. If you're interested, and if you can, please consider joining the ABA, becoming active by clicking on americanbar.org/CRSJ, which is the Constitutional Rights and Social Justice section. Again, this discussion, along with many others, is archived on the ABA CRSJ YouTube channel, and it will be shareable shortly after this afternoon. So thanks again for joining us. Best of luck in your work, and stay safe out there, everybody.